My name is Sergei, and I work as developer at InterSystems Australia in Sydney office. And today I came to you here to talk about building data-driven web apps. So the goal of our today's presentation is for you guys to leave this room with everything you need to build a modern data-driven web app. And in order for us to do that, first of all, let's talk about what the data-driven web app actually is. The traditional approach to building web applications is you generate your HTML, maybe some JavaScript, you have some CSS, probably somewhere outside of your server-side code. But pretty much you get a request, you generate the page with all the headers, menus, and then you follow some links, you get other requests to other pages, or you submit a form, you get a post request to your server, and then you reply with a new web page. So far it's pretty much what the usual web development is about. The data-driven approach is a little bit different. It became popular about 5-ish years ago. And what we do here, we actually have just one HTML page, which we never leave. So it's called a single page web application. You have your data object model in a JavaScript, which usually it comes from a server. So you get some description of what you want to display. Then you have a special suite of components, and so components and templates which determine how this data object should be displayed in HTML and what behavior it should have with the JavaScript. And it can be some simple component, or it can have some components. It can be actually a very large tree of components. And then we have some events, like somebody press a link or hit a button. You send some request to the server, you get the answer from server, and usually it's done via REST API. So you have a request in JSON object, and then you get a response on another JSON object. You change this main data model object, and then you redraw your page based on what you got from the server. It kind of sounds a little bit complicated, and it is more complicated, at least to start with, than the traditional approach. But what it allows you to do is it makes it much easier to support and to change your application, because now you don't have to go through, if you want to change some little things, you don't have to go through all the pages that your server generates. You can just change the component that's responsible for some particular parts of application that you want to change. And we will see this in action later in the presentation. So in terms of, for some reason there is no Angular image there. But really today there are 3 major modern frameworks that allow you to build such applications. Of course, you can build it from scratch. Nobody does it, because if you have a framework, why reinvent the wheel yourself? So we have Angular, we have React, and we have Vue.js. And I'm going to talk a little bit what the differences or similarities are. So Angular is built, well, Angular and React are built by 2 biggest advertising companies in the world. One is Google, another is Facebook. And Vue.js is built by one clever Chinese guy who used to work on Google, didn't like the new Angular, and decided he can do better. And some people argue that he did. So pretty much all of them have really big following worldwide. If you look closer to what each framework represents, you can easily see that when people developed Angular, they got a lot of inspiration from Java, because pretty much Google is a Java shop, as we all know. When people developed React, they got their inspiration from PHP, because Facebook is the largest PHP shop in the world. And Vue.js, Angular has kind of strange histories. There was a AngularJS version 1, and then there was Angular version 2, which was a complete rewrite of AngularJS version 1. So Vue.js is kind of continuation of ideas that were in AngularJS. So it's more, it feels closer to your normal HTML, JavaScript development than the Angular version 2. In terms of what is the biggest advantage of each framework, and again, this is very opinion-based thing. So it's what I think the advantage is. And if you ask somebody else, they have different perspectives. So the Angular is a complete framework. It has, inside the Angular, everything you need to build an application. It has the component model. It has the router, which allows you to say which component to display on the very top level based on what kind of data from server you have and what kind of URL you go to. It has libraries to talk to your server. So pretty much it is a complete framework. And the advantage of that is once you have seen one Angular application, you pretty much have seen them all. Because the internal structure of Angular is very similar across different size and different approaches to application development. React is, it's not really a framework, it's called library. So React is only the thing that allows you to build this component-based presentation. So it is fast and simple, much easier to learn than Angular. But to actually build a complete application, you need some other libraries to complete your framework. So you need routers, you need some ways to talk to server, and that is why every React application is actually different, because people grab different bits and pieces, they put it differently together. So sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. And well, Vue.js, it's complete and simple, so it kind of intersections of those two, but it also might be a disadvantage. It might be too simple for stuff you are doing, and because it's complete, it's really difficult to change it. So, well, again, disadvantages. Angular, it's complex and verbose. You have to write a lot of stuff to get going. React, as I said, it needs other libraries to make it a real application. And Vue.js, while it's cool, it has much smaller community, especially in enterprise setting, than Angular and React. But it actually has a very large community in Asian countries like China and Thailand. So if you are from those countries, maybe you will have better luck with Vue.js. To summarize, no matter what you choose, you'll be fine with any choice. So there is no clear winner around those three. It really depends on what kind of experience you have in your team and which one you like better. So I'm going to talk about Angular today because in my perspective for enterprise type of development that most of us who are working with Iris are doing, Angular is a little bit better. But you'll be fine if you choose any one of three. And so today I'll present the Angular Material Iris Starter project, which is available at this link, InterSystems Community, Angular Material Iris Starter. Pretty easy to remember, and we have it in the code repository on InterSystems Community. Can't remember the exact name. Open Exchange. Yeah. So today we are going to look into this example application that I built for you for this presentation. I didn't build it from ground up. I actually took work from another guy who did all the Angular and front-end stuff and added Iris there so that you can see how we can interact with Iris database using the Angular starter project. So when you first go to this page, there will be like a standard GitHub page with all the files, with nice screenshots, and with getting started instructions. It is a little bit more comments than you usually will see when working with starter projects. This is because we have an Iris in container, but we will have our Angular development application locally. So we will not have any Node.js, any Node modules in our Iris container. Iris will only get everything already compiled. But you will get your application and your Iris running on the same port, in the same environment, in the same container. So let's look at the features that you get out of the box. So this is a responsive application. It adapts to different sizes. So you can use it on a phone. You can use it on a full screen. For every feature that it uses, it has this nice page where you can look into documentation, how to actually use it. And this is the application that I wrote for you. So this is RESTful API application that talks to Iris. So you can create, read, update, and delete different records in your Iris database using this Angular front end. So I have a few demonstrations how you can edit stuff, how you create a new record, how you can delete things. And you can see that every time we hit some buttons, it does refresh parts of the page, but it doesn't refresh the whole screen. So it kind of feels a little bit faster. There are multiple other examples from that original project that don't work with Iris. So you can look into those as well. Another cool stuff that you get out of the box is multi-language support. So now everything is in Chinese. And another cool feature that you will get here is the system-wide preferences settings page. So you can change some of settings of your application. But most importantly, you can see how this is implemented and then do something similar in your application. So you can change a theme on the fly. You can switch animations on and off, and so on. So it's quite a cool little application that you can build upon. And well, pretty much that's enough for you to start. You can just download that stuff and start tinkering around. But I want to spend the rest of my time here talking about some aspects of Angular that I myself wish I knew before I started developing stuff there. Well, this one is pretty common. So this is Angular architecture from their documentation page. And I have it here just to give overview for those of you who never saw Angular before, so that you will better understand what we are looking at later in the presentation. So pretty much everything in Angular works around the component. And component itself has the component behavior definition. It has some component metadata, which tells us what is the tag name for this component. So when Angular finds this tag name in our HTML, instead of just outputting the HTML tag, it will apply this behavior and this template in place of that tag. And then we may have some directives. You can think about directives as like small components that change just a little aspect of behavior for some particular component. And then we have services. So services, something that, well, mostly in our today's presentation, we'll use services for client-server communication. So this is something that lives outside of your component and may be used by multiple components to talk to your server. But actually, it may be some other things, like some time management or some alert management. And there are examples of that in the startup project as well. So for example, all JavaScript failures will, instead of dumping everything to console, produce a nice alert to the user that something went wrong. And that's done via service as well. Before we dig deeper into the code, I want to talk about modern JavaScript. I myself learned JavaScript like maybe 10 years ago or maybe even more. And surprised, it changed a lot since that time. And if you are not keeping your hand on the pulse of development of JavaScript, when you first start working with Angular, you kind of look into it and say, well, what am I looking at? Is it JavaScript or is it actual Java? So I'll just quickly go through several new features of JavaScript that we need to be aware to actually work with Angular. The first one is simple. This is called arrow function, and probably most of you know about it. But pretty much instead of defining function this manner, where you say function, parameter, and then return something, you can just now do this bit. So you define parameters in brackets. You have the arrow function, well, the arrow symbol, and then you define your return value. And this list of parameters may be empty as well. So we just have brackets, and then arrow, and then the return value. The next thing is backticks. So instead of using the forward ticks to define your strings, you can now use backticks, and it's a little bit easier to define long strings this way. So instead of doing these bits with like \n and then breaking your string for JavaScript expressions, you can use this syntax to put your JavaScript expressions in, and then you can preserve your carriage return symbols when you define it this way. This is useful to define templates in Angular. Another thing, which is again kind of simple, so in JavaScript we have var keyword, which define the scope of variable to be bound to outside function. In modern JavaScript, we have two more statements, let and const. So they work similarly. They, instead of defining the scope of variable around the function, they define it around the block, as all the normal languages do. Well, I think Cache ObjectScript doesn't do that either, so you're probably familiar with how var works. But anyway, so if we will go to the next slide, when we are using var variable, this value will be defined everywhere in the function. When we are using let or const, it will be defined around just this block. And this is useful when we are using closures. So functions that are living inside other functions and may use similar kind of names, and then it becomes it leads to some very difficult to debug errors, because you think you have two different variables, and in fact you have just one. When you are using let and const, that doesn't happen. You know that this particular variable is just limited to its own little block, not to the whole big function. So that was the easy part. Now it becomes more interesting, because this is an example of very simple component definition. So here we define our component as a class with some parameter and with some decorator function and with some import statements. So let's try to see what happens here. This bit in the middle is a decorator. This is a new kind of syntax in modern JavaScript, which allows you to call this particular function. So the component bit is actually a function, which will be called on this class, or if we can actually do decorators for both class and property. So this function will be called on the next defined entity in our file, and then it will change it based on its parameters. So how this works in this particular example is we are defining some additional parameters and additional behavior to make our class an actual Angular component, and we pass the parameter that this is the selector, so the tag name that this component will listen to. This is its template URL, so this is the template that will substitute this tag, and this is the external styling for this component where you can define styles for whatever the margins are, the colors and stuff like that. So next bit is this module declaration and webpack. So this is, it kind of was inspired by Java. So you can explicitly declare for every entity you use in a particular file what exactly it actually means. So if you have a big enterprise project, probably there will be a few departments that have something that is called a component, which actually means completely different things. And using these import statements, you can explicitly tell, well, I want the component that is defined by Angular, not somebody else. And well, then in this case, it will use that declaration. So this allows you to easier manage your module systems. So if you want to learn more about it, just Google Webpack. It has a good documentation, and it will tell you more about how to work with module system. And the last bit is about classes. So again, as many of you are aware, JavaScript doesn't really have a real object-oriented development. It has the prototype-based inheritance. And this bit doesn't change it. So it's still a prototype-based inheritance for classes. It just makes it a little bit easier to define and read. Instead of doing like user.prototype.blah, blah, blah, you will have a little bit better syntax for that. So here we define a new class with two properties, with a constructor, and with a method. So as you see, we define a property without this keyword, but then to use it in actual code, we need to add this to access the property. All right, okay, last bit, the TypeScript. So again, something that Angular version 2 wanted to introduce is a better and more strong typing. And first, they invented their own AT script, which was just an Angular TypeScript. And then Microsoft invented their own TypeScript for .NET. And Angular decided, well, if we already have something that is kind of supported by big company already, let's just use this bit. So this, the TypeScript is an extension of JavaScript. So all the JavaScript code is automatically a valid TypeScript code, which is cool. It means you don't have to use TypeScript in your application if you don't want. The cool thing about TypeScript, though, is that it allows for a better IDE integration. So if you define this function, or, well, in this case, it's a class method, you can say it has one parameter of this actual type. And then when you are working in your IDE, it will tell, well, this object might have those properties. So it's much easier for you to work in your IDE. And it will, during the compilation, it will tell you if you are trying to do something that you are not supposed to do. And another cool thing that it's optional, so you don't have to use it at all in your own code if you don't want. Okay, now the tricky part, observables. So if some of you worked with Angular 1, Angular 1 was all about promises. Angular 2 is all about observables, which are kind of extension of idea behind promises. So if we look at different situations of external calls that we might get in our function, there are 4 options based on how many values we return and if the call is synchronous or asynchronous. So the easiest part is when you have just one function. So you call function, you get the value, you return back to your normal flow, and you continue in the caller function. The generator functions are another new feature of JavaScript, which I'm not going to talk about today. But pretty much those are functions that you can call multiple times to get multiple values. But those calls are synchronous as well. So you can do it in your for loop, and then you continue working in your original function. Promises and observables are asynchronous in their nature. That means that this function will not fire until some event later in time. So this is used, for example, to do your HTTP requests. When you're calling something asynchronously, you have to supply the handler function, which will be called after something is returned back after some event. So promise was developed to have just one return value. Pretty much you do your HTTP request, it returns some data, and then you handle this data. You can actually chain several handlers to one event, but it only fires once. Observable is an extension of that idea, but instead of having just one fire event, it may have multiple fire events. So actually, it's even more complex than promises, which are complex kind of by themselves. OK, well, I actually just talked about this slide, so I'll skip it. They have some similarities. So both of them can be created, transformed, subscribed, and unsubscribed. Well, you can't unsubscribe from promise because it's just one event. You don't have to unsubscribe. It will be done when it's done. But otherwise, there are some similarities. I'm not going to go very deep into code here. You can just Google how to use observables, and you will find those tables in the internet. But another thing is observable is very similar to array, because both of them have multiple values over their time. They have similar kind of functions, and they actually are named very, very similarly, as you can see here. So if you are familiar with how to work with arrays in JavaScript, working with observables is kind of a little bit more intuitive. So it's all about subscribing to a particular subset of events if you have to. Again, this is a complex thing. I'm not expecting any of you to understand it from these 3 slides, which are kind of not very obvious at all. Just something for you to keep in mind before you start working with Angulars. Try to understand what observables are. It will help you a lot. All right. So now I'll go into a quick demo. We will add. So you remember there was a table with information about books. We are going to add another column to that table on both server and client side. So I will start with the studio code here and just go a little bit through the structure of our project. We have a CLS folder there with all the server-side code, on Iris. And we have a projects folder here with all the client-side code in Angular. And it is nicely arranged into several folders. So you have some core and shared components. You have feature components. And then finally, you have this example bit where we have all our CRUD example code. The first thing we will change here is definition of what the book is on the client side. So this is a TypeScript thing. It will tell our IDE what the type of book actually is. And as I said, this is optional, but you can see here that once we change that definition, it now says, well, now you're missing something that's required there. This is the component definition. So we define our HTML selector and template and CSS file. And here we will now fix this error. So when we create a new book, we will initialize year with an empty string as well. And now we will go to, just go and have a look what the actual component is. But pretty much it has handlers for create, update, delete, and edit events. And my table is actually in a separate component. So you should try and keep your components simple and limited in their scope. So here we added a material table. So this is the material design component. It has a special syntax to define what each column consists of. So those are really simple things. It's just one header and one value. You can do really complicated stuff with that. And the last bit, we'll add this new column to the list of displayed columns in the book list. So we'll add year between author and description. So that's pretty much all we have to do on the client side. Now we need to compile this. And while it will be compiling, I will go to the server side and edit the iris definition for to add a new property in our database. So I'll go back here, go to our server-side code. So there is the book.book class, which holds my persistent data. And well, since I'm lazy, I will just uncomment my new properties. But pretty much, yeah, so it only has the actual structure and this reset demo method, which gets a list of books and then defines a book based on that list. So I will run this reset demo method again. To do that, I'll go to my Docker container. So if I do this docker ps, it will tell me what the container name is where my Angular project is running. So I go in there, run iris terminal iris. So this connects me to the iris inside my container. Go to the namespace where my project is and run this reset demo method. So now it will kill all my books and recreate the database with the new property assigned. And the last bit I have to do is to change my REST interface. Multiple ways to define my REST interface. This is the simplest one, and it's a little bit silly because you just define it like as it is, without any tricks. And in real, so you can see that, oops, what happened? All right, yeah, here it is. So here we just define everything in our code. In the real situation, you will probably have some superclass that you pass your parameters in, which will do stuff like this for you. So you can see that now if we go to our REST API here, it will show us the new property here. And if you want to learn more about REST, there will be another session straight after mine in this class where they will show you how to do this bit better. Instead of doing it all by hand, you will use the API manager. All right, so we enable new property for all the create, update, delete calls in our REST class, and now we can see that we've got a new column in here. Nice and easy. All right, so before we finish, I know that you guys will remember just the last thing that you see, so the most important thing is just at the end. Actually, two things. One thing is with REST APIs, especially with all the samples that you find on the internet, including my sample here, you will see that they have one database entity and one REST call. And that may easily lead to a page that has to make multiple REST calls to actually display all the data that it needs. So instead of doing the database-driven REST APIs, you really should do the workflow-driven REST APIs. So you have to get all the information you need to display a particular page in one call, otherwise it will be a performance nightmare very soon. Another thing is try and keep it simple. It's very easy to create monstrous components. So don't do this, it becomes complicated very quickly. I have one such component myself in track here that everybody is now scared to go into. So try to make it right from the very beginning. So again, you can download and play with this example from InterSystems community GitHub page and go and build something that matters. There will be something.
Here's to you, the builders, the minds behind the world's most important applications, the creators of the most transformative user experiences. The work you do has revolutionized industries and improved the lives of millions. Since the day we were founded, InterSystems has been dedicated to helping developers and architects harness the power of data to do amazing things. So go build. Build something amazing, something important, something that matters.
Hope you were inspired. If you want to learn more about REST APIs, stay in this room. There will be another great presentation. If you want to learn more about Docker and how this works with a Docker, follow me to level 2. I will have an experience lab about Docker. We have plenty of availability there, so everybody is welcome. We have a few minutes left, so if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer you. We will need to use mic though.
Okay. At the very beginning, you've shown a page with the about component. I'm not sure how the link is made. Is it because it's the same words that were separated with dots, or?
No, there is a special router that you can configure what you have in your URL and which component you will display in place.
No, I meant the map, rec map or rep map, or I don't remember this slide exactly. The one in which we define the CSS, the HTML, with the component. How is the link made between the title Angular IRIS starter, the about component in the bottom, with the two over it?
So link between this and this?
Yes.
Yeah, so this, let's go to the previous slide. So this decorator, it always is for the next thing that it encounters.
Okay.
So you have to have it directly above your class definition.
Okay.
You've shown some frameworks, 3 of them were there. We are developing the front-end side with a framework which is an open source called Sencha. You ever heard of it?
I think it's for mobile application, right?
Yeah, you can do mobile applications with it as well as on screen. So
not much. Yeah.
We will transfer our application in the first step towards Iris, but then we are facing the goal how we go in future with this ERP system, enterprise resource planning stuff on the front end side. So maybe then we have to decide to go for something new and different to us, for us, with us, or however I call it. You have a recommendation? You say, well, use Angular?
Yeah, well, at the moment, I think the Angular is the best for enterprise kind of software. The trick about front-end frameworks is they die within 5 years. So if it takes you more than a year to go to Iris, I'm pretty sure there will be a new kid on the block that is the new hype and new best. So this is why I also advise people to try and keep as much of your business code and your actual workflows on the server side. Because about front end, just a bit you know that it will always change. You will have new devices, you will have new browsers, you will have a new approach to development, and it's just the way of things. Your front end always has to evolve.
And what we are doing is with Sencha, we built that front end with that, but we run it in a browser. So we use, for example, the Google Chrome as a front end. Every user uses Google Chrome on his PC and enters the data then in this Sencha stuff, which communicates with the Cache database. And there is even one more component between it, which we have to check out probably in the future.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so thank you guys.